I was sitting alone in my office when the call came in. Late afternoon light slanted through the blinds, turning the dust in the air into slow-moving sparks. I remember noticing that detail because everything after that moment feels burned into me, sharp and permanent. I picked up the phone, expecting another routine confirmation. Instead, I heard the steady, professional voice of the senior banking director I'd been dealing with for months. He cleared his throat before speaking, the way people do when they're about to say something that changes your life. "The transaction has officially closed," he said. "Total proceeds are $57 million. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from." I didn't respond right away. I stared at the legal pad on my desk and my own handwriting scribbled there from earlier that morning. Estimates, projections, conservative assumptions. All of them were wrong. "Are you certain?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I expected. "Yes, sir. Funds have cleared. Congratulations." I thanked him, ended the call, and just sat there. $57 million. After 4 decades of managing warehouses, mixed-use buildings, and tired old brick structures that most people drove past without a second thought, it was over. The properties my father had started acquiring when I was barely old enough to read were finally sold. Not because I had failed, not because I had been forced, but because it was time. I was 68 years old, and for the first time since my early 20s, I didn't have to wake up worrying about tenants, permits, boilers, or lawsuits. I didn't have to keep carrying the weight my father had passed down to me with a handshake and a quiet warning, "Take care of this. It's all we have." My hands trembled as I reached for my keys. I didn't call anyone. Not my accountant. Not my kids. Not my attorney. There was only one person I wanted to tell first. My wife. We had been married for 41 years. Long enough to outlast trends, recessions, and more than a few personal storms. She'd been there through the early years when money was thin and hope was thinner. Through the financial crash that nearly wiped us out. Through nights when I came home smelling like dust and oil because I'd been fixing something myself to save a few $1,000s. This was supposed to be our moment. I drove home faster than I should have, my heart beating like I was 20 again. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac near Lake Briarwood, the kind of place you move to when you think you've finally found stability. I pulled into the driveway just before 3 in the afternoon. Her car was there. That surprised me. She told me she had a museum board luncheon downtown that usually dragged on until early evening. I smiled, thinking maybe she'd slipped out early. Maybe fate had decided to give me a perfect moment. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, still smiling, still holding the words in my chest like a gift I couldn't wait to unwrap. The house was quiet at first. Too quiet. Then I heard laughter. It floated down from upstairs, light and familiar. My wife's laugh, the one I could recognize in a crowded room. It used to make me feel lucky. Then I heard a man's voice. Low, relaxed, intimate. I knew it instantly. Caleb Morris, my attorney for nearly 2 decades. The man who had handled every major transaction I'd made since my early 50s. The man who had overseen the sale of the properties. The man who had eaten at our table, toasted holidays with us, and watched my grandchildren tear wrapping paper off birthday gifts. My body stopped moving, but my mind didn't. It raced ahead, searching for explanations. Innocent ones, professional ones. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand wrapped around the banister, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't hear words clearly. I didn't need to. The tone told me everything I didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to climb those stairs 2 at a time and shatter whatever illusion was happening up there. Another part of me, the one that had survived 40 years in business, held me in place. Shocked to strange things. So does instinct. I stepped back out of the house without making a sound. I sat in my car for a full minute before starting the engine. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove, past neighborhoods I recognized, past roads I'd traveled 1,000 times without seeing them. By the time the sun began to sink behind the hills, I had pulled into an overlook above the river. I sat there for hours, watching the water darken, replaying years of conversations I had once dismissed as harmless. Late calls, shared jokes, trips that overlapped just a little too neatly. Then another thought crept in, colder than the rest. Caleb had handled everything: the sales structure, the temporary holding accounts, the recommendations for tax strategy, the accounting firm. I felt something twist in my stomach. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about control. When I finally went home, it was close to midnight. My wife was in bed, reading, her expression calm and familiar. "You're home late," she said. "Long day," I replied. She smiled and asked how the sale went. I told her it was successful. Her eyes widened, and in that moment, I realized something that would change how I saw everything that came after. She didn't already know. I barely slept that night. My wife's breathing was slow, and even beside me, the familiar rise and fall that had once been comforting. Now it felt like a reminder of how little I truly knew the person lying inches away. I stared at the ceiling until the numbers on the digital clock blurred together and lost meaning. Betrayal doesn't arrive all at once. Not really. It seeps in, rearranging your memories, forcing you to re-examine moments you once filed away as ordinary. I replayed everything. The charity galas Caleb always seemed to attend. The late-night conference calls that somehow included my wife just to weigh in. The trips she took to visit her cousin in Northern California, trips that coincidentally aligned with Caleb's legal conferences in the same cities. At the time, I called it coincidence. Trust makes you generous with explanations. By morning, something inside me had settled. Not peace, not anger, something colder and more precise. Clarity. At breakfast, my wife chatted easily about celebrating soon. Maybe a small dinner, maybe a trip. I nodded, smiled, played my part. I'd spent decades negotiating contracts without revealing my bottom line. This wasn't so different. After she left for the day, I sat in my office and opened the filing cabinet that held every document related to the sale. I told myself I was just reviewing things for my own understanding. That was the lie I used to take the first step. I started with the basics: purchase agreements, escrow confirmations, the structure Caleb had recommended to simplify tax exposure. On the surface, everything looked clean, professional, elegant even, but elegance can hide complexity. By the third hour, I noticed something small: a consulting fee buried deep in the closing documents. Not illegal, not even unusual, unfamiliar. The firm name meant nothing to me. I searched it. A limited liability company registered less than 2 years earlier. No website, no public clients. The address traced back to a suite in a building where Caleb's law firm had once leased space. I felt my pulse slow instead of quicken. That's when I knew this wasn't paranoia. Over the next several days, I expanded my search. Bank statements, transfer authorizations, temporary holding accounts that had been changed without my explicit approval, always justified in emails with phrases like administrative efficiency and timing considerations. Caleb had always been good with language. I checked the escrow company listed in the final transfer documents. It wasn't the firm I'd approved. It was another one, smaller, quiet. A deeper look revealed something else. Caleb sat on its advisory board. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I could confront him, demand answers, watch him scramble for explanations. But 40 years in business had taught me something essential. People reveal far more when they think they're safe. That afternoon, I made a call to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. His name was Daniel Price. We'd served together briefly during my early years in the Coast Guard Reserves before he transitioned into private investigative work. He was methodical, discreet, and, most importantly, patient. We met 2 days later at a diner off the highway, the kind of place nobody remembers seeing twice. I didn't dramatize anything. I slid a thin folder across the table and spoke plainly. "I need you to look into 2 people," I said. Quietly, he flipped through the pages, his expression tightening just enough to tell me he understood the gravity. "How far do you want this taken?" he asked. "As far as the truth goes." He nodded once. While Daniel began his work, I continued mine. At home, nothing changed. Or at least, nothing appeared to. I laughed when appropriate. I discussed retirement plans. I listened while my wife talked about future trips and home renovations. All the while, I felt like I was watching a performance for backstage. Every night after she fell asleep, I reviewed documents, cross-referenced dates, and reconstructed timelines. Patterns emerged. Small transfers at first, amounts easy to overlook, then larger ones clustered around specific milestones in the sale process. Always routed through intermediaries Caleb controlled. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was orchestration. 2 weeks in, Daniel called and asked me to meet again. He placed a thick envelope on the table between us. Photographs, he said quietly. Travel records. Financial overlaps. I didn't open it right away. There's more, he added. A joint account. Opened about a year and a half ago. Names match your wife and your attorney. I exhaled slowly. How much? I asked. Just over $4 million, last I checked. Gradual deposits. I opened the envelope then. There they were. Restaurants. Hotels. A beach resort, she'd told me, was a wellness retreat with friends. The timestamps stretched back years. This isn't just personal, Daniel said. It's financial, and it's ongoing. That night, lying awake beside my wife, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I wasn't going to stop them early. I was going to let them believe they were winning. Once you accept that someone you love has betrayed you, the mind does something remarkable. It stops asking why and starts asking how. That shift saved me. I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even tell my children. Emotion clouds judgment, and judgment was the only weapon I had left. Instead, I focused on the numbers. I called the accounting firm Caleb had recommended for the capital gains work, posing as a man who simply wanted reassurance. The young associate on the phone was polite, confident, and completely unprepared for the questions I asked. I requested confirmation of estimated tax payments that had supposedly been made on my behalf. There was a pause, then another. I'm not seeing those reflected here, she said carefully. My grip tightened on the phone. I asked her to check again. She did. Same answer. I thanked her and hung up, my suspicion crystallizing into certainty. The next call was to the Internal Revenue Service. I expected long hold times and vague answers. What I got instead was clarity. No estimated payments had been received under my name or business entities for the amounts listed in my closing documents. Someone had written checks that never arrived. Or worse, checks that arrived somewhere else. I spent the next week buried in spreadsheets and scanned documents, mapping out transfers and authorizations. I wasn't just looking for missing money anymore. I was reconstructing intent. That's when I saw it. A consulting agreement dated 3 weeks before the sale closed. Signed electronically. My name attached. The signature was perfect. Too perfect. I compared it to others. The stroke pattern was off. Subtle, but off. I hadn't signed it. The agreement authorized a fee of $3 million to a firm called North Shore Strategic Solutions. The address traced back to a mailbox service. The registered agent traced back to a holding company. That holding company traced back to Caleb. I sat in my office long after dark, the house silent, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room. The realization settled slowly, heavily. This wasn't theft after the fact. This had been planned before the sale was ever finalized. Caleb hadn't just facilitated the transaction. He had engineered it. Daniel met me again at the diner the following morning. I need more, I told him. Movements, meetings, who they talk to, especially internationally. He didn't ask questions. A week later, he slid another folder across the table. Your attorney has been in regular contact with an offshore legal consultant, he said. Based in the Caribbean, specializes in asset shielding and rapid transfers. I felt my jaw tighten. How often? I asked. Weekly, sometimes more. That same week, I noticed something else at home. My wife had begun talking differently. Not about us, but about options. About how quickly life could change. About how important it was to be flexible when opportunity appeared. She asked about prenuptial clauses she hadn't mentioned in decades. About how assets might be divided if circumstances shifted. I answered calmly, casually. Inside, I was building a timeline. By the end of the month, I had enough evidence to know the scope of what was happening. Shell companies, layered accounts, advisory fees, transaction coordination charges. all flowing outward, all pointing back to the same small circle. In total, more than $8 million had already been siphoned away. And based on upcoming scheduled transfers, far more was about to move. I understood then why Caleb had urged patience when the money cleared, why he insisted the funds remain in temporary structures, why he advised me not to rush. They weren't just stealing, they were preparing to disappear. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table and finally allowed myself one honest emotion. Not rage, resolve. If I moved too soon, they'd scatter the money beyond reach. If I waited too long, I'd lose everything. There was only one way forward. I needed professionals who knew how to dismantle something this carefully built. The next morning, I made a call that would change the balance of power. The woman who answered the phone didn't recognize my name at first. That was intentional. Names carry weight. History, expectation. Mine had accumulated all three over decades of business, litigation, negotiations that ended with handshakes and silence. This time, I needed none of that. I needed neutrality, distance, a clean entry point unburdened by reputation or emotion. Patricia Alvarez, she said. Her voice was measured, professional, neither warm nor cold. How can I help you? I introduced myself without context. No background, no cues, no explanation for why I was calling after nearly 20 years of silence. I asked if she remembered a complicated audit we'd worked through together early in her career, one that involved disputed valuations, layered ownership, and a client who insisted numbers were opinions rather than facts. There was a pause, not a long one, just long enough to signal that she was searching memory deliberately rather than reflexively. Then a soft laugh. I was wondering when you'd call again, she said. You don't usually reach out unless something's wrong. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask how bad. She didn't express concern. That was how I knew I'd made the right call. People who live in complex cases learn early not to rush the truth. They let it arrive on its own. We agreed to meet the following morning. Her office downtown occupied the upper floors of a building that had once housed shipping magnates and insurance firms, places where disputes were settled with documents rather than raised voices. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and old paper. Security was unobtrusive but present. No reception chatter. No televisions tuned to news. Patricia's office itself was quiet in a way that felt earned. Framed certifications lined one wall, interspersed with court exhibits and large transaction charts, annotated flow diagrams, exhibits that had once explained complicated truths to juries. Nothing decorative, nothing personal. Even the plants looked intentional rather than ornamental. She stood when I entered. We shook hands. Briefly. You look tired, she said, not unkindly. I haven't slept much. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Tell me what you brought. I brought everything. Not metaphorically, literally. Sale documents from the company exit that should have set me free. Bank statements spanning years. Daniel's preliminary findings. Screenshots of transfers that hadn't made sense when I first noticed them. Consulting agreements bearing my name, but not my signature. Email chains that, in retrospect, read like rehearsed performances. I placed them on her desk in careful stacks. Labeled, indexed, cross-referenced. I'd learned long ago that credibility often begins before anyone reads the first page. Patricia didn't interrupt. She read, annotated, cross-checked. Occasionally, she asked for a clarification, not about intent or motivation, but about timing, sequence, access, authority. Her pen moved constantly, marking margins, drawing arrows, circling figures. The room grew heavier with every page she turned, not emotionally, structurally, as if gravity itself were increasing, pulling the narrative into coherence. After nearly an hour, she leaned back and folded her hands. This is not messy, she said. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself until that moment. Messy would have meant chaos, sloppiness, mistakes. Messy could be argued away. Deliberate could not. It's deliberate, she repeated. Whoever designed this understands thresholds. They know how much money can move without triggering institutional alerts. They stagger transactions to avoid pattern detection. They used layered entities to obscure origin and destination. She turned one of the pages back toward me. They're exploiting compliance blind spots, not breaking systems, using them exactly as designed. She looked at me directly. But they got greedy. She pointed to a series of recent transfers. Her finger didn't shake. It didn't linger. It simply moved from line to line. Here, and here. Too much, too fast, especially after the sale closed. That's where intent becomes provable. Before that, you could argue strategy. After that, it becomes extraction. I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the first night. I'd stare at those numbers and felt something shift permanently. Is this criminal? Yes, she said without hesitation. Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, possibly tax evasion. And if offshore movement is involved, and I strongly suspect it is, federal agencies will take interest. I nodded, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it spoken aloud collapsed the last space for denial. I need this built properly, I said, quietly. She studied me for a moment, evaluating not the request, but the discipline behind it. That means you don't confront anyone, she said. You don't change behavior. You don't freeze accounts. You don't signal suspicion. You let them believe they're in control. I can do that, I replied. I already have. That earned a slight nod. Patricia outlined the plan with surgical calm. Full account access, document replication, transaction tracing across entities and jurisdictions. A living timeline updated daily. Every assertion supported by independent verification. Every document preserved in original and duplicate form, with chain of custody intact. This has to survive hostile examination, she said. Not just scrutiny attack. Defense attorneys will assume nothing is accidental. Neither can we. If this goes the way I think it will, she added, you won't just recover money. You'll dismantle the entire structure. For the next 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was the relief husband, the man who had finally exhaled after decades of responsibility. I discussed retirement ideas at breakfast. European river cruises, a smaller house closer to the city. Maybe philanthropy, someday something meaningful, something legacy-oriented. My wife seemed energized, affectionate even. She touched my arm more often, laughed more easily, spoke about the future with a lightness that had been absent for years. It was the hardest performance of my life. By night, after she slept, I became a witness to my own financial dissection. Patricia's team worked methodically, not quickly, methodically. Every entity was mapped, every transfer categorized. Patterns emerged only when viewed longitudinally: small, reasonable fees accumulating into devastating totals. 7 separate shell entities tied directly or indirectly to Caleb. Some registered domestically, structured to appear boring and compliant. Others international, nested within jurisdictions chosen not for secrecy, but for complexity. Fees stacked on fees, legal review charges, transaction coordination payments, advisory retainers, special purpose consultations, each one defensible in isolation. Together, a siphon. By Patricia's count, nearly $10 million had already been removed from my control. Daniel's surveillance filled in the human side. Meetings at hotels near the airport, places designed for transients, not memory. Encrypted phone usage that spiked after business hours. A briefcase that changed hands once and never reappeared. One evening, Daniel called while I sat across from my wife, pretending to watch a cooking show. They met today, he said quietly. Your attorney and an offshore specialist. Hotel conference room. Timing suggests imminent movement. How much? I asked. Based on what we've seen, he said, at least 15 million. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and accepted the truth fully for the first time. They weren't just planning to take money. They were planning to erase me. Divorce filings timed for maximum leverage. Asset division claims constructed around manufactured entitlement. A clean exit funded entirely by my life's work. Patricia confirmed what I already knew. If they move that money offshore, she said, retrieval becomes exponentially harder. There was one option left. I made the call the next morning. Not to confront them, not to threaten, but to people who understood exactly how these games were played and how they ended. Federal buildings are designed to make you feel small, not intimidated, just aware. A subtle recalibration of scale. The ceilings are higher than necessary, the hallways longer, corners sharper. Everything reminds you, without saying so, that whatever you're carrying in with you, it has been carried before, many times, and often by people who thought their situation was unprecedented. It never is. I passed through security without incident. Shoes on, belt on, no theatrics. The guard didn't look at me twice. That anonymity felt deliberate, institutional. You weren't meant to be remembered on the way in. The interview room was plain to the point of austerity. Neutral paint, a table with rounded edges, 3 chairs, a wall clock positioned so that it was visible from every seat, its ticking audible but not loud enough to complain about. A bottle of water sat untouched near the center of the table. 2 people entered a moment later. They introduced themselves only by first name and badge. 1 man, 1 woman, both unremarkable in appearance in the way that only experienced investigators can manage. Nothing about them invited confidence. Nothing discouraged it either. They sat. They waited. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't begin with betrayal or emotion or shock. I didn't talk about marriage or trust or the way it feels when a life you thought was stable reveals itself as provisional. None of that mattered here. Feelings are noise in rooms like this. Facts are currency. So I laid them out. Documents first. Timelines. Patricia's forensic summaries. Transaction charts that showed money moving in shapes that only made sense once you saw them all at once. Daniel's surveillance notes. The shell entities. The forged signature on the consulting agreement. The offshore contacts that appeared only after the sale closed. The woman agent Reynolds asked questions as I spoke. Not why do you think this happened? When did this transfer occur? Not how did this make you feel? Who authorized this payment? The man said very little. He took notes. Occasionally, he asked for a clarification. Not a challenge, just precision. He wanted edges clean enough to cut with. Time passed without anyone acknowledging it. The clock ticked. Pages turned. Pens moved. At the end, Agent Reynolds closed the folder gently. Not with finality. With care. This is significant, she said. And it's ongoing. That word settled heavily. Ongoing meant urgency. Ongoing meant leverage. Ongoing meant that the window for intervention had not yet closed. They explained the process without embellishment. White-collar cases don't explode. They constrict. Slowly at first, then all at once. Quiet subpoenas issued without headlines. Silent account monitoring. Controlled observation designed to understand not just what is happening, but how people behave when they believe they are unobserved. They were already watching. They just hadn't acted yet. What happens now? I asked. You continue exactly as you are, the man said. No confrontation. No deviation. Let them finish what they think they're doing. I understood immediately. The most dangerous moment in a scheme like this isn't the beginning. It's the end. For the next 2 weeks, everything accelerated, though only I could see it. Externally, life appeared unchanged. Breakfasts, evenings, casual conversations that skimmed the surface of shared history. But underneath, the current quickened. My wife became restless, distracted. She spoke about independence more often, about how life was too short to stay stuck in routines. She framed these observations as realizations rather than rehearsals, but repetition has a way of revealing intent. She mentioned Seattle twice in 1 week, both times casually, both times as if testing the sound of the word in the air, gauging whether it would echo or pass unnoticed. Caleb called more frequently, always professional, always reassuring. Just a little more patience, he said during one call. We're optimizing final positioning. Final. That word had weight now. I thanked him, asked the right questions, sounded appropriately deferential. A client trusting his advisor to manage complexity beyond his understanding. Agent Reynolds called me late one night. They've scheduled the move, she said. This weekend. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. She understood what that meant for me, even if she didn't acknowledge it. I stared at the wall while she spoke. Amounts, timing, methods. It was all there, large enough to matter, small enough to believe they could get away with it. The final extraction before disappearance. My wife announced a weekend trip the following evening. A reunion. Friends she hadn't mentioned in years. A last-minute invitation framed as coincidence rather than convenience. I smiled, helped her pack, folded clothes with practiced normalcy, kissed her goodbye at the door. She didn't hesitate. That mattered more than I expected. Saturday morning, I drove north myself. I parked across the street from a luxury hotel overlooking the water. One of those places designed to feel detached from consequence. Valet parking, glass walls, a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus and money. I waited. At mid-morning, I saw her enter the lobby. She looked happy, not relieved, not anxious, happy. At 11, unmarked vehicles arrived. They didn't rush. They didn't block entrances. They positioned themselves with the patience of people who knew time was on their side. At 11:30, everything ended. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Agent Reynolds called me shortly after noon. "They're in custody," she said. "Both of them." I closed my eyes and sat there for a long time. Not relieved, not angry, just finished. Something had reached its conclusion. Not the story, just the lie. The version of my life that required performance, restraint, vigilance. When I eventually drove away, the hotel disappeared in the rearview mirror without ceremony. So did the last illusion that this had ever been fixable through conversation. It had always required an ending like this. Quiet, controlled, final. Justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. There are no sirens once the arrests are made. No public spectacle. No sense of climax that matches the internal pressure that preceded it. Instead, it arrives with paperwork, with calendars and folders and neutral-toned rooms where people speak in measured voices and never raise them. The weeks after the arrests blurred together into a procession of conference rooms, sworn statements, and quiet hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Buildings designed for process rather than emotion. Places where outcomes are shaped incrementally, through accumulation rather than drama. I gave depositions. Not once, but many times. I answered the same questions phrased 10 different ways. Dates, amounts, authorizations, intent. Each session began with reminders about accuracy and ended with warnings about consistency. The truth, I learned, is not enough on its own. It has to be stable under repetition. It has to survive boredom. Patricia was there for most of it. She sat slightly behind me, rarely speaking, occasionally intervening to clarify a point or redirect a question that drifted toward speculation. Her presence was grounding. She knew when silence was stronger than explanation. She knew when to let a prosecutor push and when to stop the push before it became noise. Her forensic work became the backbone of the case. Every dollar now had a path. Not a suggestion, a path. Origin, movement, destination. Each shell entity was no longer an abstraction, but a structure with fingerprints, articles of incorporation, registered agents, shared IP addresses, overlapping signatories. What had once felt like a maze resolved into a system. An elegant one, unfortunately. Caleb had built it with care. He understood not just the law, but enforcement. He knew where attention lingered and where it passed quickly. He had designed the structure to look boring, compliant, almost dull. No sudden spikes, no dramatic withdrawals, just a steady bleed disguised as professional compensation. That elegance unraveled under scrutiny. The same sophistication that made the scheme efficient made it legible once the right questions were asked. Patterns emerged. Repetition revealed intent. Efficiency betrayed scale. What surprised me most was how much more there was. Federal investigators widened the aperture, looking not just at my accounts, but at Caleb's professional history. 2 previous clients surfaced within weeks. Their situations weren't identical, but they rhymed. Smaller amounts, shorter timelines, early-stage versions of the same architecture. Practice runs. My case wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination. The difference was scale and timing. The sale of my company had created a moment of liquidity too tempting to ignore. What had once been incremental became ambitious. What had once been cautious became accelerated. Greed isn't always reckless. Sometimes it's simply impatient. Caleb's law license was suspended within weeks. The announcement was brief, procedural, worded carefully to avoid conclusions that hadn't yet been adjudicated. But in his world, suspension was enough. Clients don't wait for verdicts. They retreat at the first hint of uncertainty. His accounts were frozen shortly after. Properties seized, including a waterfront condominium purchased outright through one of his entities. It was tastefully furnished, professionally staged, the kind of place meant to signal success without excess. It was later traced directly to misappropriated funds. Not indirectly, not partially, directly. I was shown photographs during one meeting. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view designed to feel permanent. Nothing is. My wife tried denial first. She claimed ignorance, claimed trust, claimed she'd been manipulated by someone more knowledgeable, more persuasive. She cried during her initial interviews, spoke about confusion, about not understanding financial complexity, about believing she was protected. That defense collapsed methodically. Prosecutors produced joint account records bearing her authorization. Not passive inclusion, active consent. Then travel correspondence emails discussing timing, location, coordination. Then audio excerpts of conversations that had been recovered from devices she hadn't thought to wipe. Conversations about exit strategies, about before things change, about how long it would take me to notice. She stopped crying after that. What followed wasn't anger. It was calculation. Her attorneys shifted posture. Less defiance, more negotiation. Damage control replaced denial. They stopped asking how to win and started asking what could be minimized. The court proceedings stretched on for months. White-collar cases always do. There were motions, delays, attempts to suppress evidence on technical grounds, arguments about jurisdiction, about intent, about whether certain actions constituted criminal behavior or merely unethical conduct. None of it worked. The paper trail was too complete. The timeline too consistent, the coordination too explicit. Every argument that relied on ambiguity dissolved under repetition. When the outcomes finally arrived, they were stark. Caleb received a federal sentence measured in decades. There was no outburst when it was announced, no visible reaction. He stood still, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtroom. The man who had once spoken confidently about strategy and risk management said nothing. Reputations, I learned, don't die loudly. They evaporate. His was gone within an afternoon. My wife accepted a plea. Conspiracy, financial fraud, cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her punishment was shorter, but no less final. There would be no version of her future that resembled the one she had planned. The divorce was settled in parallel. Adultery, combined with criminal conspiracy, triggered every clause she'd once dismissed as unnecessary. Provisions we'd signed years earlier during a period of mutual optimism suddenly mattered more than anything else. She left with nothing. No accounts, no property, no claim to the money she'd helped steal. I recovered most of the proceeds. Not all. Millions were gone spent on travel, legal structures, professional fees, and the very mechanisms used to hide them. Recovery, I learned, is rarely complete. Justice doesn't rewind time. It reallocates what remains. What remained was still more than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to walk away. Enough to choose something else. I sat alone in my attorney's office the day the final judgment was entered. Patricia shook my hand. Not triumphantly. Respectfully. This was an ending, but not a celebration. She gathered her files with the same care she'd shown at the beginning. Take some time, she said. People underestimate what this costs. After she left, I stayed. The room was quiet. Sunlight filtered through blinds that had seen thousands of similar moments. Some victorious, some devastating, all procedural. I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Release. The weight that had pressed on me for months, years, really lifted without ceremony. No rush of emotion. No surge of satisfaction. Just the absence of vigilance. For the first time since the numbers had stopped making sense, I wasn't waiting for something to happen. It already had. People assume that when the court decisions are finalized, when the sentences are handed down, when the money is mostly returned, something inside you snaps back into place, as if resolution were a mechanical act, as if the mind simply accepts a new configuration once the old one has been disassembled, tightened, and certified as functional again, as if justice were a reset button instead of a reckoning. It doesn't work that way. What happens instead is quieter, almost imperceptible at first. The noise that once filled every hour recedes, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like machinery powering down after years of constant use. Calls stop coming. Calendars empty. Deadlines evaporate. And in the sudden stillness, you discover how much of your identity had been built not around who you were, but around what you were constantly guarding against. Vigilance had become my posture, my default stance, even before I knew why. When it disappears, you don't feel relief immediately. You feel exposed. The phone stops ringing. At first, you notice it subconsciously. You check it out of habit. No missed calls, no new messages, no notifications demanding immediate attention. The device that once felt like a tether now feels inert in your hand. The meetings end. Conference rooms that had become temporary anchors vanish for your schedule. There are no agendas to review the night before, no briefing documents to skim in the morning, no need to rehearse statements, clarify positions, or anticipate objections. The professionals who had surrounded you, from months attorneys, investigators, analysts, consultants, move on to their next cases with efficiency and courtesy. They shake your hand, wish you well, mean it. Their tone is sincere, but already forward-facing, oriented toward the next problem that requires their expertise. Then they disappear, not abruptly, just completely. And one morning, you wake up in a house that no longer feels like yours, in a life that no longer resembles the one you spent decades constructing. The house hadn't changed, not materially. The walls were where they'd always been. The furniture sat in the same positions. The light still fell through the windows at familiar angles. But familiarity without attachment is a strange thing. It turns spaces into replicas of themselves, accurate, intact, and hollow. I stayed in the old house longer than I should have, not out of sentimentality. That would have implied affection, nostalgia, or longing. None of those were present. Out of inertia, after months of reacting to crisis, decision-making felt strangely burdensome. Every choice, no matter how small, carried the residue of consequence. Even trivial decisions, what to eat, where to go, how to spend an afternoon, felt heavier than they should have. The house, for all its ghosts, was predictable. It didn't require interpretation. It didn't ask questions. It didn't demand anything from me. But it carried too many echoes. Rooms where conversations had been rehearsed, where words had been chosen carefully, deployed strategically, sometimes withheld altogether. Hallways where silence had once been interpreted as peace rather than avoidance. Corners where trust had lived comfortably, unexamined, the way trust always does until it doesn't. Every object had context now. The dining table where we'd hosted dinners, negotiated family decisions, planned futures that turn out to be provisional. The couch where we'd sat side by side, watching television while speaking around what we didn't want to say. The bedroom where sleep had become performative long before it became scarce. Even neutral spaces had been infected by memory. The kitchen, the garage, the study, places where nothing dramatic had happened, which somehow made them worse. They were reminders that betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it integrates seamlessly into routine. I downsized within 3 months, not out of necessity, out of need. The decision came without ceremony. One morning, I realized that staying had stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like self-neglect. The house wasn't helping me heal. It was keeping me anchored to a version of myself that no longer existed. The new place sat near the edge of town. Smaller, quieter, intentionally unremarkable, close enough to familiar streets that I didn't feel dislocated, far enough that I didn't feel watched by memory. There were no grand views, no statement architecture, no design choices meant to impress, just clean lines and functional space. Room size for use, not display. windows that admitted light without dramatizing it. It felt temporary in the best way. Not provisional, not uncertain, simply open-ended. A place designed to accommodate change rather than resist it. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, one piece at a time. I noticed that I gravitated toward objects that served clear purposes. A chair that was comfortable rather than stylish. A table that held weight without complaint. Bookshelves that didn't ask to be curated. For the first time in years, my environment felt neutral. Not aspirational, not symbolic, just sufficient. My children struggled in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I had expected anger, accusation, withdrawal. Those reactions would have been easier to contextualize, easier to respond to. Instead, what they experienced was destabilization. They weren't angry at me. They were angry at the lie they'd been unknowingly living inside. They questioned their memories, re-examined moments they'd once accepted as benign. Family trips, celebrations, ordinary days that had once felt cohesive now carried a residue of doubt. Not because those moments had been false, but because the framework supporting them had been compromised. When trust collapses, it doesn't just affect the present. It rewrites the past. Holidays felt different. Traditions that had once provided continuity now felt fragile. Conversations skirted around certain topics. Names went unspoken. Laughter came more cautiously, as if joy itself required vetting. Trust, once damaged, doesn't announce its return. It rebuilds unevenly, if at all. There were days when everything felt normal again, when conversation flowed easily, when shared history felt intact. And then, without warning, a question would surface. A glance would linger. A silence would stretch just a second too long. Healing, I learned, doesn't move forward in a straight line. It loops, doubles back, stalls without explanation. I learned to answer questions without defending myself. That was harder than it sounds. Defense had been my reflex for months. Explaining timelines, justifying decisions, clarifying intent. In legal contexts, defense is expected, required. But in personal ones, it can become corrosive. It shifts focus away from understanding and toward absolution. I learned to say, I don't know, when I didn't. To say, I'm sorry, without attaching conditions. To sit with discomfort without trying to resolve it prematurely. One afternoon, my son asked a question I'd been avoiding myself. What are you going to do now? It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't anxious. It was curious in the way only children can manage direct without being demanding. It sounded simple. It wasn't. Money can insulate you from immediate fear, but it doesn't give you purpose. If anything, it can delay the search for one. Without urgency, time becomes heavy, directionless. Days stretch without shape. Weeks blur. I had spent my adult life accumulating responsibility, building systems, managing outcomes, solving problems that came with measurable results. Success had been defined by scale, efficiency, growth. Even leisure had been scheduled, justified as recovery rather than enjoyment. Now, there was nothing to solve. That absence was more unsettling than crisis had ever been. During those weeks, I thought about my father often, not in flashes of nostalgia, but in sustained reflection. In the quiet moments when nothing demanded my attention, his voice surfaced not in words, but in principles. He hadn't built his life around accumulation. He'd built it around responsibility. The properties were never trophies to him. They were tools, a way to provide, a way to belong to something larger than himself. He understood ownership as a form of stewardship long before the term became fashionable. Resources, in his view, were not rewards. They were obligations. He believed that walking away entirely was a kind of abdication, not because rest was undeserved, but because disengagement carried its own cost. To opt out completely was to deny the utility of what had been built. The thought stayed with me. Walking away, quietly liquidating, retreating, insulating myself from future risk would have been easy. Tempting even. It would have satisfied the instinct to protect what remained, but it would have felt like another loss, another concession. So I didn't. With guidance from people far smarter than me, people who understood governance, accountability, and restraint, I established a foundation in my father's name. The process was slower than I expected. Intentionally so. Structures were debated, oversight mechanisms defined, conflicts of interest anticipated and mitigated. The goal was not agility. It was durability. Its mission was narrow by design. Legal support and financial counseling for people betrayed by those they trusted. Not broad reform. Not systemic overhaul. Specific intervention where it mattered most. Seniors whose retirement accounts had been hollowed out by advisors they'd known for decades. People who had believed that longevity implied loyalty. Small business owners undone by partners who understood the books better than they did. Families who lacked the resources to pursue justice once the damage had been done. We funded clinics, education programs, emergency representation for cases where timing mattered more than perfection. There was no marketing campaign, no press release, no announcement designed to signal virtue. Visibility was limited to those who needed the services. Intake processes were discreet. Outcomes were tracked internally, not publicized. I stayed involved, but not visibly. This wasn't about recognition. It was about structure, about making help available without making it performative, about creating something that functioned even when I wasn't in the room. The first time I sat across from someone who'd been defrauded by their own advisor, I recognized the expression immediately. Not fear, shock. The particular shock that comes from realizing that competence and trust are not the same thing. They spoke haltingly, apologetically, as if being deceived were a personal failing rather than a professional crime. They minimized their losses, qualified their anger, explained themselves as if explanation were required. Shame surfaced before anger, confusion before resolve. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't tell them my story. I didn't need to. Presence was enough. Understanding didn't require disclosure. It required recognition. Helping didn't erase what happened to me. There were still mornings when memory arrived uninvited. Still moments when a casual remark reopened something I thought had closed. Still absences where certainty used to live. But helping gave the experience shape, meaning. The past didn't feel redeemed. That wasn't possible. Nothing could make what happened necessary or good, but no longer felt random. It fit into a narrative that extended beyond my own loss. I wasn't rebuilding what had been taken. I was redirecting what remained. Time passed, not dramatically, just steadily. The future, I learned, doesn't arrive whole. It accumulates quietly, decision by decision, boundary by boundary, not in declarations, but in habits, not in resolutions, but in consistency. Purpose, when it finally settles in, does so without announcement. No ceremony, no validation, just a sense of alignment that wasn't there before. And that was enough. I'm 72 years old now. That number surprises me sometimes when I say it out loud. Not because I feel young. I don't, but because for most of my life, age felt like something I was racing toward. A finish line where responsibility would finally loosen its grip. I know better now. Age isn't release. It's perspective. Most mornings, I wake up before the sun. Old habits die slowly. I make my coffee the same way every day and sit by the window while the world outside transitions from dark to gray to light. It's quiet. Intentionally so. I read the news on a tablet instead of paper. My hands shake just enough to remind me I'm human. Then I head to the foundation office by 9. We're small, purposefully lean. 3 legal clinics. A rotating team of counselors. Volunteers who understand that betrayal isn't dramatic, it's disorienting. I meet people every week who've been swindled by contractors, advisors, even their own children. Their stories differ in detail, but not in damage. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal cleanly. I never tell them my story unless they ask. When they do, I keep it brief. Because the point isn't what was done to me. It's what they're going to do next. I play golf on Fridays with Daniel, who's retired now too. We don't talk about the case much. Some things don't need revisiting. On Sundays, I have dinner with my daughter and her family. Tuesdays are lunch with my son. We've rebuilt what can be rebuilt. Slowly. Honestly, every so often, someone asks if I regret waiting as long as I did. If I regret trusting the wrong people. If I regret not seeing the signs earlier. The answer is complicated. Yes, I regret the pain. No, I don't regret trusting. A life lived in constant suspicion isn't a life. It's a siege. What I've learned is this: betrayal is not a failure of character on the part of the betrayed. It's a decision made by the betrayer. You don't prevent it by hardening your heart. You respond to it by hardening your strategy. That distinction matters. Last year, I received a letter from my former wife. It arrived without warning. No return address. 3 pages. Carefully written. Apologetic in tone. Explanatory in content. She spoke of manipulation, of fear, of poor choices made gradually rather than suddenly. I read it once. Then I placed it in a file drawer and closed it. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a debt you owe someone else. It's a process you decide on when you're ready or not at all. She applied for parole not long ago. Whether she's granted it isn't my decision. Justice already took its course. My role ended when the truth was told and the consequences followed. As for Caleb, I stopped tracking him after the sentencing. I heard through indirect channels that prison has not been kind to him. Some might call that karma. I don't. I call it consequence. There's a difference. People sometimes assume this story is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge is impulsive. Justice is patient. Revenge seeks pain. Justice seeks balance. What they tried to take from me wasn't just money. It was agency, dignity, the right to decide the final chapter of my own life. They failed, not because I was angrier, but because I was quieter, smarter, willing to wait. If there's a lesson here, a real one, not a slogan, it's this: when betrayal shows itself, do not rush to react. Document, observe, ask for professional help, build your case with care, and when the moment comes, act decisively, not emotionally. Justice favors preparation. I don't live extravagantly now. My house is modest. My routine is simple. My calendar is full in ways that matter. I have peace, and peace, I've discovered, is worth more than any amount of money, even $57 million. That's not revenge. That's freedom.